Thank you for being here. This is my crew right here. Yeah. A little presentation on the composer Leroy Robertson. How many of you have heard of Leroy Robertson? He holds a special place in the hearts of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. He is probably the most objectively successful Mormon composer in history. Right? Is that right? Let's say it this way. He was a very successful composer who won one particular very prominent award and did have a large impact on the music scene in Utah and in the Intermountain West. This is a book that was written by his daughter, Marianne Robertson Wilson. Yeah, I'm going to be reading from this book, hopefully not at too much length, but there are some passages that I'm going to have to. So it'll be a little bit of story time. Do you guys like story time? Yes. We pretend that we're in the local public library and you're sitting on the floor. He was born in 1896 in Fountain Green, Utah, which is a little town in Utah, and his parents, his father was a sheep herder. So he was born to a family of sheep herders, and that's what he did growing up. He herded sheep, and but he had a gift for music. He was a precocious young person, very intelligent, very curious, wanted to learn a lot. A story is told that when he was very young, they were at a fair or something and he went missing and they were panicking and trying to find him, and eventually they found him standing in front of the bandstand with his hands behind his back, just absorbed in the music of the band. There was an organ in the house, and normally the parlor room where the organ resided was off limits, but he was allowed to have access to it, so he was always playing on the organ a lot. If he could find someone to pump the bellows for him, because of course it was a mechanical organ with mechanical bellows, he had this burning desire to play the violin. They had a talking machine, which I guess is some kind of a record player, and he would listen to Schubert's Traumerei on an arrangement with an arrangement for cello, and he just was obsessed with the sound of string instruments and wanted to produce that beautiful tone. And so but of course they had no money for a violin, and so he built his own violin, got a cigar box and carved F-holes in it, and took many hours to craft this instrument very carefully, and finally got it all together and made a bow and cut some hair off of the horse tail for the bow, and then it was done. When it was done, he tried to play it, and of course it sounded horrible. It didn't sound it didn't make any sound at all, really. And someone said to him, "Oh, you need rosin on that bow." He didn't even know. So he went to the local mercantile store and he bought a 5-pound bag of powdered rosin, which is more rosin than a professional violinist would need in their lifetime, right? So he put a lot of rosin on it and then played it again, and at least it made some sound, right? But the sound was pretty horrible. Well, his father eventually broke down, and so they would take the wool to Omaha to sell, and his father went to Omaha and bought a violin there for $12 from Sears Roebuck. And which $12 would have been a lot of money for rural sheep herders in Utah in the 1920s, right? So he finally got an actual violin and was so excited to play it. And when he got the bow and he played it, he was horrified at the sound. And he was in tears. And his parents were like, "We just sacrificed a huge amount of money to buy this violin, and you're still not satisfied?" And it's not because there was the problem with the violin, but he just didn't know how to play it correctly, and he was just so upset about that. So they found a violin teacher for him, and they paid 25 cents a lesson for violin lessons. And but he was very determined, and before long he learned how to play the instrument well. And that was, that kind of yearning desire for education and for applying himself to education and to improving himself became a theme throughout his life, as we shall see. One Saturday evening, as he boarded the interurban train at Payson to return to Pleasant Grove, he happened to sit beside Apostle Marvin J. Ballard, a high dignitary in the LDS Church. Apparently intrigued by this earnest young man and his violin and briefcase filled with music, Elder Ballard engaged Leroy in conversation. Upon learning that Leroy aspired to be a serious composer as well as a first-rate violinist, Elder Ballard told him of a wish he himself had long held in his heart that someday some composer would write an oratorio, something on the order of Handel's Messiah, based on scripture found in the Book of Mormon. This whole incident sparked in Leroy an ambition and dream that stayed with him thereafter, but which would achieve reality only some 30 years later with the completion of his oratorio from the Book of Mormon. This is a dream that many members of our church have held, especially leaders of the church have always, not so much lately, but in previous generations. One of our presidents, President Kimball, used to talk about this a lot, about how we in this church we need to be producing great art. Our leaders don't talk about that as much anymore, but this has sort of been a dream of like discovering a Mormon Handel. It's sort of a dream that people have had. So Leroy, tried to do that, and he wrote this enormous oratorio, which we'll talk more about shortly. So throughout high school, he was involved a lot in music and formed a lot of groups together with other students. And he had a friend who had studied at the New England Conservatory. And actually there had been a number of students from Utah who had gone to the New England Conservatory. So Leroy eventually went to the New England Conservatory and studied with a composer by the name of Chadwick. And when he got there, he was super eager to get started. He went right up to Chadwick, showed him his music, and he had written this thing called the Grand Waltz, which he was really proud of. He thought it was a good piece of music. And Chadwick looked at it and said, well, after some time you'll get better at doing this. And Leroy was in his early to mid 20s by this time, and he was sort of shocked to discover that all the other students at the conservatory were much younger than him and better than him. But he was from the backwater of Utah, right, a sheep herder, and really didn't have a lot of opportunity. And so he always felt this sense of I think he always felt this sense that he had to catch up, that he had been wasting his time, and that he needed to catch up. So he worked so hard to improve himself, and he to the point where he made himself sick, and his health deteriorated. But he definitely won the approval of his instructors and became one of the best students. And in fact, I think Chadwick suggested that he apply for the Rome Prize at one point. So he ended up getting like a certificate, a couple certificates from the New England Conservatory. And then in 1925, he became a faculty at BYU School of Music. And there wasn't much of a school of music at that time, so he applied himself to creating it and did a lot of work in that regard. He was always organizing ensembles and getting students and colleagues together. So he created the BYU Orchestra, which is a very fine orchestra. Actually, they do a lot of touring, and they're a very good student orchestra. BYU has it's almost exclusively undergrad, but their choirs and orchestras are top-notch, really. So, okay, so he's teaching at BYU since 1925, but he always sensed that he needed more training somehow, like he needed to catch up. And he was a huge fan of the composer Ernst Bloch. Anybody know Ernst Bloch? That was Leroy Robertson's jam right there. Sacred music. How would you describe the harmonic vocabulary of that music? Is it tonal? Is it modal? It's modal. Yeah. So, it's yes.
Modal.
Modal. Good. You're right. It's 1920s, so it's post Wagner. After Wagner, this sound is not really in fashion anymore, right? So you got to do something else. And composers, conservatively minded composers like Bloch, are going to turn to modes. Vaughan Williams, lots of early 20th century composers are writing modal music like this, right? Yeah, so Robertson really admired Ernst Bloch, and Ernst Bloch took up a teaching position at the San Francisco Conservatory. When Robertson learned about this, he was very keen to study with Ernst Bloch, and so he actually moved his family to San Francisco and lived here for a little while, and went to the conservatory. So he studied there for like one semester, I think, and then during the summer was going to take some summer classes, but then Bloch abruptly decided to move back to Europe. So Robertson was very disappointed about this, and again, this is kind of a theme in Robertson's life. So they returned back to Provo, and he was kind of disappointed, but what could he do? Resumed his teaching at BYU. When Bloch left San Francisco, it was a terrible blow for Leroy, and the composer Bloch wrote a nice note to Leroy saying, "One of the very few with great sympathy." So, yeah, right? Isn't that nice? So a year or so went by, and Robertson really, really wanted to keep studying with Bloch. So he wrote to Bloch in Switzerland and said, is there any way that I could come over there and study with you? And he got a nice warm reply saying, yes, there's a place you can stay that's not too expensive. You should come at once, right? So that was nice, but then it was a question of, how do you make that work? And so he and his wife talked about it a lot, and his wife, his name is Naomi, said, I think we'll be all right. So he took the journey to Europe by himself. Actually, he went with another friend from Utah who was also a musician. They traveled together. But he left his wife and kids behind and to go study with Ernst Bloch in Switzerland, and really with no clear idea of when he might be back. So it takes like 3 weeks or something or longer than that to go all the way from Utah to Switzerland. So anyway, he gets to Switzerland. He shows up the day of with pencil and paper in hand, ready to start working. And so they studied together for a while, and sometimes would have hour-long lessons, and sometimes would go walking in the forest looking for mushrooms. And so he had a wonderful time there. And then he also arranged to have studies with a musicologist in Berlin. So he was in Switzerland for a little while, and then he traveled to Berlin and studied in Berlin for a little while. In the winter of 1933, Berlin was becoming a dangerous place to live. Hitler and his Nazis, now established in the capital city, were fast consolidating their alarming power. By the end of January, Hitler had been named Chancellor of Germany, and a few weeks later, arsonists torched the Reichstag, the House of Parliament. Dreaded black shirts, Hitler's elite stormtroopers, filled the city. No one seemed to know what would happen next or how to prevent it. Leroy and JJ was his musician friend from Utah, who resided in a Jewish neighborhood, witnessed firsthand the Nazis' ruthless destruction as stormtroopers raged all over the place, breaking into Jewish stores, caving in windows, dragging out shopkeepers, throwing goods out in the streets, and looting, unquote. Even the two Utahns were accosted from time to time. For example, one day, after making some purchases in a Jewish shop, they found their path blocked by Nazi sympathizers, men and women, who mistaking them for Jews, harassed them at the doorstep and kept them from leaving the building. Can you imagine? Not one to be intimidated, Leroy stood his ground and cursed them roundly in very obscene English, laced with swear words so vile as to make one's hair stand on end. I'd like to know exactly how vile that got. Rabble that they were, the crowd somehow understood. Backing away, the troublemakers apologized, saying that they were not against the English. Leroy, still furious, quietly explained in his very good Hochdeutsch that he and JJ were not even English, but Americans come to study in Germany. Yeah, on another occasion, they witnessed a van pull up and herd an entire family into the van, and nobody from that family was seen again. And when that happened, his friend JJ chose to leave Germany and resume his studies in London. But Leroy, determined to complete his year's sabbatical in Germany, opted to remain in Berlin. As a matter of fact, Leroy's innate curiosity would not let him rest until he had seen Adolf Hitler up close and in person, if possible, for he truly could not comprehend how this madman had been able to arouse the German people to such fury. Therefore, when it was announced that Hitler would be speaking one evening in Berlin's vast Sportspalast, Leroy devised a way to get past the redoubtable SS guards and into the building. He and a missionary friend made up some very fancy press cards, which identified the two as reporters for the Improvement Era, an LDS publication, which actually is now called the New Era, if it's still around. Once in the vicinity of the Sportspalast, they of course found every block cordoned off and all streets blocked by Hitler's black shirts. Hearts in their throats, but undeterred, they bravely flipped out their copies of the Improvement Era and flashed their press cards before the troopers at each blockade. So impressive were their credentials that they were somehow allowed to pass by. At the building's entrance, not only were they admitted, but promptly escorted to the seats in the front row of the International Press box situated directly above the speaker's platform. Hearing Hitler at such close range repelled Leroy and awakened in him a dreadful foreboding of what lay ahead. This contempt and fear he continually expressed in several compositions dating from this time. And that's pretty amazing, right? He made fake press credentials for the Improvement Era and tricked the SS into letting him into the, yeah. It's cool. So while still in Berlin, Leroy, his daughter talks about how he had this melody that was sort of going around in his mind, this sort of aggressive melody. But he didn't know what to do with it, like he was struggling to figure out how it could work in a composition. Then one day, as he was casually walking down the street on his way to a lesson with Dr. Leichtentritt, another tune hit him. Realizing at once that he had found the companion or foil to his problem melody, he stopped and whipped up from his briefcase the ever-present manuscript paper. Then, propping his foot on the ledge of a nearby shop window, with briefcase and paper balanced on his knee, he began to write as quickly as he could, oblivious to all else. The music that came almost faster than he could notate it. When he breathlessly ceased writing, I love her description. When he breathlessly ceased writing, a scant few, When he breathlessly ceased writing, a scant few minutes later, he had composed non-stop from beginning to end the entire Etude in G minor for pianoforte. A passionate and dramatic work in which he never changed a single note thereafter. Some 20 years later, citing Aristotle's definition of the enthusiastic poet, Robertson would refer to this etude as having been composed by a person of intense feeling who wrote in a transport of frenzy. So you want to hear that piece now? Yeah, of course. Yeah. What do you think?
Very aggressive.
Yeah?
Making me nervous.
Yeah?
It was like if you were like a piece of fabric getting ready to be sewn. And it's like really scary because like if you're like sometimes when you're sewing it's like scary. It's like this.
It goes fast.
It's fast and scary and there's a needle.
Mm.
And it's thumping down. It's really cool.
Okay, so, but again, like, you know, he was so working so hard, overworking, pushing himself to learn and do as much as he can. And so he got sick again and was so bad that he went to the hospital and to the point where he sent for his wife. So his wife dropped everything in Utah and got on a train and got on a boat and came across the Atlantic Ocean and arrived 2 weeks later. During those 2 weeks, his condition worsened and he eventually had an appendectomy while she was en route. And so he was convalescing when she arrived. And so it took some time to recover. And then when he did recover, they ended up having a nice sort of honeymoon together. And went to Paris and various other places. They saw a performance of Wagner's Meistersinger. And Leroy, his wife Naomi was somewhat neutral, but Leroy, it says, completely entranced, could not help muttering, that was worth the whole trip. Stopped in New York and Chicago, and they went to the Chicago World Fair in 1933 as well. All right, finally got back to Utah, penniless but happy.